First of all, I wish to thank the organizers, the journal Conatus, and the Center for, as you call it, for Applied Philosophy of the University of Athens, and particularly Professor Vangelis Papadakis for the invitation to join in this important day conference. Having to do, it's a day of remembrance, the relevance of the Holocaust for bioethical thinking today. It is well known that one of the historical pillars of the birth of bioethics was the Nuremberg trial, the doctor's trial, where some, and only some, of beliefs and policies followed by Nazi doctors and public health officials came to the fore, became known to the international community, and they made the whole world reflect upon the goals of science and its role in the modern world. When it comes to the role of medicine, public health, biology, but also behavioral and social sciences, when it comes to assessing the role they play in the rise of the Nazis to power, as well as the implementation of the final solution, there is so much to be said in terms of historiography. My concern here is not the historiography of what one might say, the medical Holocaust, but a reflection upon the arguments that the defendants in the trial used in order to defend their deeds. There were different kinds of experiments, as again is known and investigated. There were different methods and organizations of research, and there is a debate as to whether it was just mere marginal pseudoscience, whether it was just very low quality science or mainstream science. I would say the latter, relying on historical sources. The places of the experiments also differed, concentration camps, but also research centers, well-known research centers. The research on human beings conducted by Nazi doctors and implemented by health officials and policymakers reflected a moral pathology. It put the value of a human being under question. The research, and this was not denied by the defendants either at the trial, was involuntary. I'll say some things about this. There were some shades of difference here. Based on deeds of pain and suffering, agony, torture, degradation, ultimate harm, that is death, destructions of lives unworthy of living, referred mostly to the mentally handicapped, the mentally ill and the handicapped at first. Now, what I would like to ask you to reflect upon is the fact that the 23 defendants, there were 23 defendants, out of whom only 3 were not doctors. They invoked here are some of the reasons they gave, the convictions they had. Allow me to say that they never showed any sign of regret, any sign of apology for what they had done. They were well-trained, competent physicians and physician scientists, investigators, who conducted their experiments on the ground, some of them on the ground of racial hygiene, murdered, demented, or the racially inferiors, as they call them, whose lives were not worth living. The convictions. Firstly, the research subjects volunteer with the prospect of pardon and possibly release. So the idea was that prisoners, in order to volunteer in taking part in those experiments, were given the hint or even the promise that they might be released after the experiment, if they survived. So this gave to some defendants the ground to argue that the subjects in fact volunteered. So experimentation was justified, for it was to their benefit. Freedom, release from prison and the camps. But firstly, that was straightforwardly false, and we have documentation from witnesses who survived. There is one in the London Sunday Observer in 1989 who says that he was given this promise, but it never came true. But the moral argument here is this: even if they kept their promises, research on vulnerable subjects would have been unethical, for the latter would have been given an offer they could not have rejected. There was an asymmetry of power, and participation was merely coerced. And it is unethical to offer participation in painful, disabling, potentially or actually killing experimentation on a ground of a bargain to achieve freedom as a trade-off. The second argument, that these prisoners were going to die, and they were going to die anyway. So, as prisoners, they had nothing to lose. They were going to die. But precisely because they were prisoners, and in an absolutely vulnerable position, it was morally absolutely legitimate to be recruited for those experiments. Even those condemned to die cannot be treated as mere means, as instruments to achieve further ends, violating humanity in their person. Thirdly, the scientists were not responsible after all, because the scientists are not responsible for moral values, only for explaining empirical facts. The pursuit of knowledge is separate from the implementation of values, value-free science. So they claimed that the scientists and the researchers and the physicians were not responsible because they had no moral expertise. They had no expertise in values. Therefore, they were not accountable for their actions. The researchers were responsible for the proper design and the scientific implementation of the research of the protocol, but they did not feel moral responsibility for what happened in the concentration camps because they followed orders. They followed orders from a higher authority. Thus, they claimed, and this is a quote from the transcript of the trial, if the experiment is ordered by the state, this moral responsibility of an experimenter towards the experimental subject relates to the way in which the experiment is performed, not the experiment itself. That was the argument. But there are no experts in moral values, as we all know. Physicians and researchers were agents and took responsibilities, should have taken responsibilities in the way they had acted, including action in the laboratory or in the clinical practice. Doctors and scientists were not exempt from moral criticism simply because they obeyed order. An order is to be obeyed if it is moral, but does not acquire its moral strength and its moral legitimacy simply by being ordered by a higher authority. This is a fallacious argument from authority, which is debunked in moral theory. It's reducing the validity, the moral validity, to its genesis, to its source. And that is a conceptual, epistemological, normative, and moral fallacy as well. The source does not determine the validity. They said they were arguing, some of them, that they were acting for the security and the survival of the country in conditions of emergency, in conditions of a total war. Balancing, therefore, and I underline, the interests of the state and those of the experimental subjects. When we balance the two, the former should prevail. I'll come back to this later on. The exploitation of human beings was justified, that was another argument, to serve the goals of science and the interests of society. The rights and interests of the few should be balanced against those of the majority and of society. Finally, ethics is relative to place and time. Standards vary. Here is an interesting passage. We're not interested in finding out what the ethical attitude of the medical profession in the United States was. In my opinion, says Dr. Sauter, a German physician who in Germany performed experiments on Germans cannot be judged exclusively according to the American medical opinion, which moreover dates from 1945 and was coded in the following years for future use. It can also have no retroactive force. This is an example of moral relativism. Now, a few more thoughts about the three pillars of the argumentation that I've just given you, of an ethics of conviction, of course. Ethical standards vary from place to place and according to time. Therefore, acceptability defines rightness. We did not have those rules back then, therefore we did nothing wrong. Bernard Williams has written a beautiful piece all on the script there. The most absurd view to have been advanced in moral philosophy, he says, is relativism. In its vulgar form, it consists of three propositions. I would like to draw your attention to this true proposition. That right means can only be here understood as meaning right for a given society. The genesis determines validity. That right for a given society has to be understood in functional terms. It helps the nation survive. It helps the advancement of science, and so on and so forth. And that therefore, it is wrong for people in one society to condemn or interfere with, etc., the values of another. The view, says brilliantly Bernard Williams, is clearly inconsistent since it makes a claim in its third proposition about what is right and wrong in one's dealing with other societies, a universal claim, which uses the non-relative sense of right, not allowed, however, for this use in the first proposition, everything is relative according to society. This leads, he says, to a logically unhappy attachment of a non-narrative morality of toleration and non-interference to a view of morality as relative. Moral relativism conflates the source of the moral judgment with its validity. Acceptability, however, does not equal normative validity or moral rightness. It's not an epistemologically coherent thesis, and secondly, it leads to morally unacceptable conclusions, thus failing to normatively guide action adequately. No matter what happens at the other end of the planet, whether minorities, women, and so on and so forth are treated inhumanely, it's their business, it's not ours, it's not our society that we talk about. Secondly, the inviolability of the human agent. Now this is very important. Dignity, moral autonomy, and voluntary consent. I would like to say a few things about this. Moral justification, if it is to be grounded on firm grounds, I would say, has to deal and try to understand human agency. Human beings have the capacity for reason. We human beings are agents who reason for our actions. We exert freedoms and therefore take responsibility for our freedoms. We can act on principles. Moral autonomy is the common human perspective. Here is a quote from Immanuel's Kant Critique of Pure Reason. Every person's own will directed to himself is restricted, morally speaking, to the condition of agreement with the autonomy of the rational being. That is to say, such a being is not to be subjected to any purpose that is not possible in accordance with the law that could arise from the will of the affected subject. Hence, the subject is to be used never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Sharing the rule or the principle by the will of those who are going to be affected by it. This is the very core of moral ascription. Moral autonomy, therefore, is not individual, it's moral autonomy, is the ratio of human dignity. That means that persons as agents who can exert freedoms rationally and take reasons and take responsibility for those freedoms have unconditional worth. Dignity, I should stress, is not merely a right, not merely a value, it's a status. It's a status of moral agency, and as such, it's presupposed by all rights and by all duties. The inviolability of the human being as a person means non-instrumentalizing a human being, but also respecting that human being in his or her own person. Now, fundamental and derivative moral categories and principles derive. Fundamental principles do govern medical research as well on human experimentation. It's respect for persons, the well-known principles of bioethics derive from this. It's non-maleficence, it's beneficence, it's justice. And ineliminable, I underline because I'll come to this in a minute, ineliminable rights of subjects to self-determination, to consent or dissent from research conducted on them. Violation of one's self-determination is one of the many ways of failing to respect a research subject as a person. Now, what about consent? Consent is neither the beginning nor the end of moral reasoning. Consent there is a key clause in the Nuremberg Code, the first article, the absence of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or any other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, voluntary consent. But voluntary consent is a procedural principle. It operationalizes personal autonomy as self-determination. And it therefore furnishes a safeguard against deception and coercion. But it can be overridden by substantive moral principles. Certain acts are morally legitimate regardless of whether the person affected consents to their performance or not. If I ask you to mutilate me or cannibalize me, are you going to do it? If you are not exempt from moral criticism. The act is still morally impermissible. Moral understatement it is to say that what the Nazi doctors and scientists did was immoral because they did not abide by consent requirements. Now my last part of the talk. Balancing interests, balancing rights, one against many, some against the state, the welfare of society, the interests of the state, the advancements of science, no. And here are some thoughts very quickly. The rights of the experimental subjects must always prevail. Why? First of all, I would like to draw a distinction. Sometimes people confuse, both in moral theory and legal theory, rights with interests. They're distinct. Rights are derivative from the status of the moral status of a human being, from dignity. So, to the extent that dignity cannot accept trade-offs, rights, fundamental rights, cannot accept trade-offs. They cannot be balanced against each other. Interests can. They have to do with the well-being, but interests of persons. But interests concern us because we respect persons. Rights are not susceptible to trade-offs as they derived from the status of human beings as bearers of dignity. Now this is depicted very well both in the Helsinki Declaration and the Oviedo Convention. The interests and welfare of the human being shall prevail over the interest of society or science, towards an ethics of responsibility, not an ethics of conviction. It's duty-based, fundamental moral principles generate moral obligation, they generate moral rights. The moral evil in Nazi doctors and researcher deeds lay in violating fundamental moral principles, not merely because the prisoners and the victims did not consent, associated with the dignity and the autonomy of human beings, thereby violating their status as moral agents, by inflicting injury, disability, suffering, coercion, degradation, torture, death to innocent persons, for the purpose of obtaining some ulterior end, such as useful knowledge for their war efforts. Here we have individual responsibility, but also institutional responsibility. Universities, academic institutions, research centers. I'd like to finish with a phrase of George Santayana: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Thank you very much.